to give independent advice to the government on simplifying the UK tax system to make things easier for taxpayers. I'm saying this now to emphasise that tax simplification, albeit in a broad sense, is our subject today. It's not about decisions that rest with government in terms of policy on revenue raising or enforcement, for example. So we won't be considering or answering questions on those sorts of issues, including what might be in the next budget. We are grateful for the wide interest in our work and the participation of many in the development of our advice, including from those listening now. We have carried out a mini survey on our reputation with a selection of stakeholders leading up to this conference, and we will pick up some of those points made to us during the webinar. Just looking at our agenda and who will be speaking, our speakers include the OTS's Tax Director, Bill Dodwell, as well as representatives of HM Treasury and HMRC, but other OTS board members are also listening in. I'm very grateful to Jill Rutter, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and a former Senior Civil Servant at HMT and other departments, for agreeing to give us a talk on the OTS's work, which I'm sure will be challenging and stimulate debate. I would also like to thank Emma Agimang of the Financial Times, who reports on tax and who will moderate the Q&A session, and I'm sure she will keep that challenge up. First, though, I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined by the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, the Right Honourable Jessie Norman MP, to give the opening presentation. Jessie was appointed Financial Secretary in May 2019. Financial Secretary, we welcome your comments. Thank you very much.
Well, Catherine, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, all, I think I see 164 participants on this great seminar, and what a fantastic thing that is. Congratulations. And congratulations to the OTS on its 10th anniversary. It's a very special occasion. I knew it was a special occasion before I tuned into this, but I doubly knew it when I saw Bill Dodwell wearing a tie. That perfectly illustrates how special the occasion is, and I thank you all for making it happen. As I think you will all know, the OTS originally had its genesis in 2010. The then Conservative Party had a manifesto commitment to set up an independent Office of Tax Simplification to suggest reforms to the tax system. It was elected, it's been carried into government, and the OTS has been doing its thing highly effectively ever since. And I'm very grateful to you, Catherine, to Bill, to David, and to the whole team for all the work that you have done over those intervening years, and your predecessors before you. If I may, I'm going to touch on 3 areas of interest, I hope, to those participating today. One is the government's continued commitment to simplification of the tax system, how important that is. The second is OTS's contribution to simplifying and improving the tax system over the past decade. And then the third is the future role and the work of the OTS and how that might develop and fit in. And then I'm very happy to take your questions. So let me just kick off. I've already thanked you, Catherine, and the other top team. Let me also mention some of your predecessors, Andrew Knight, Michael Jack, previous tax directors, Paul Morton, John Whiting, and Jeremy Sherwood, who was the head of office before. So that's a very distinguished roll call of public servants, and I thank them. I thank you all. Now, as you all know, in 2016, the government put the OTS onto a statutory footing. It did that, first of all, in recognition of the work it had done and the maturity it achieved as not just an organization, but an institution, but also because it wanted to strengthen its role in providing independent advice on simplifying the tax system. And putting it on a statutory basis in legislation was the way to do that. And I think that itself was evidence, if evidence were needed, that the government is and remains very interested in simplification. It's not easy to see, given how complex the tax system is, and you know, there's going to be no need, no absence of need, I should say, for the OTS's services over the next few years, because the pressures on the tax system, the pressures on tax legislation are ever increasing. But the aspiration should be there and should always be there, and that is to have a system that is simpler, not just because simplicity is good in itself, although I think it is, but because it frees up administrative time and money that people have to expend in dealing with it, that reduces the cost of compliance. It gives, therefore, businesses more time and resources to focus on doing what we want them to do, which is growing their business, being thoroughly successful, offering products and services to people around the country, around the world, successfully, and growing their own firms. So all of that is good. But of course, simplification also improves trust. People know what to expect. It helps to prevent or inhibit, and sometimes to combat, intentional or unintentional avoidance. It cuts down on the opportunities to avoid tax or to make mistakes. And as you will know, as any tax pro will know, errors are a huge component of the tax gap, and we're always looking to reduce the impact that they have. And of course, it makes it easier and less costly for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs themselves to administer, because it, of course, if it's done properly, reduces taxpayer contact, it reduces stress and load on the taxpayers that HMRC treats as its clients and its customers, and of course it makes it easier to understand what their tax obligations are, and that's good for everyone. Now, of course, it would be very naive at all not to suggest that there can be a trade-off between simplification and other tax policy goals. The reason we have a complex system is not far to seek. Government's under a lot of different pressures. It's constantly seeking to reduce inequality. It's constantly seeking to head off or address forms of intentional avoidance. And of course, there may well be the collateral effects of policies that are thoroughly well designed in many other ways. They have the effect of increasing some of the complexity of the tax system. And of course, there's also a slight tendency within government to look to the tax system to solve problems that perhaps ought to be addressed by other policy measures, and to look to HMRC, given its extreme professionalism and quality as an organisation, to try to address those issues as well. So all of those factors are in the mix. But I think, and I think every fair-minded person who looks on would agree that the OTS has very much risen to the challenge that we set, and it's supported the government. It hasn't done so in any dependent way. It's done that, it's supported it, I think, in striking the right balance between those objectives of simplification and the other objectives that government constantly faces with legislation and the evolution of taxpayer behaviour. And of course, it's done that not just for individuals, but also for businesses. That's in particular smaller businesses. And I think that's a tremendously good thing to have done. And I'm, of course, myself personally, I've only been in this job about 15, 16 months, although I'm becoming a bit of a veteran, of course, as you will appreciate on that basis, given the amount of turnover you sometimes see. But in ministerial positions, but the OTS I was an admirer of the OTS when I was on the Treasury Committee for 5 years, and I have been ever since. And of course, what I've liked about it is that it's been prepared to have that engaged and intelligent expert conversation with government that allows it to address policies that affect large numbers of taxpayers on many occasions, to achieve quick wins on the rare but important occasions when those are possible, and to, above all, to maintain momentum and deliver benefits for taxpayers. All of that is, I think, to the good. Let's just touch on some of those achievements then over the last 10 years. We're not, if we're having an Oscar ceremony, I think the audience is entitled to know in virtue what the Oscars being presented. So first of all, I don't think people quite realise that the OTS is the first sustained attempt in the world to bring a really systematic and expert and properly researched approach to bear on issues of tax simplification. I think that's a very important thing to say. And of course, its contribution therefore arises out of that combination of systematic thinking, research and expertise. And of course, over that period, OTS has highlighted key issues, it's stimulated debate, it's actually a catalyst for change. And of course, it's been available in its reports, not just the ones government has sought from it, but the ones it has sought to bring forward itself for wider scrutiny and enable a wider perusal of government policy, and that's all to the good. Let's pick some highlights out. I think it would be wrong not to mention first and foremost the 2011 Small Business Review. That was a very important moment. It led to the introduction of a cash basis for accounting for unincorporated businesses. That's been a great boon to some of our smallest businesses, and of course it's minimised the need for complicated accounting adjustments on that basis. That's been a great achievement, I think. The focus of the OTS on reliefs, I think, has been very important. Obviously, there's a lot of parliamentary interest. There's a great deal of interest within the Treasury, within this building, in trying to tighten up reliefs, to make sure that they're properly reviewed, they're value for money, they're appropriately sunsetted, etc. And as you will know, we're doing a lot of work on issues of reliefs across HMT and HMRC. But as I mentioned, of course, there is also work that's been done on OTS's own initiative. And that's important in terms of driving thinking, both in this building and outside it. And there one might single out the 2016 gig economy work, the report there. And of course, that's become terribly central to our thinking about platforms, taxing multiple income streams across employment and self-employment, withholding tax, and the rest. And you have seen in the last finance bill that we're taking action on some aspects of that same wider agenda through the digital services tax. So those things are all good. But also, just finally, let me highlight one thing, which is also making interventions in some more difficult areas. And there isn't an area of tax that's much more difficult than VAT. And so some of the work that OTS did in its 2017 VAT review, very helpful, just for kind of keeping an even balance between the different interests that come to bear in the issue of value-added tax. So that's all great. If we're thinking about looking forward, though, what do we want from a really, up and running, fully functional, heavy-hitting OTS? I think the answer is this: we want to continue to focus on delivering a resilient tax system. We want simplification, of course, but we also want resilience. We want to reform, and this is a particular bugbear of mine, tax administration. It's probably the least sexy part of tax, also probably the most central in many ways to people's actual lived experience of paying tax. Very important in terms of allowing the revenue and customs to maintain a completely secure system in the face of cyber threats and the like. Very important to make the system as a whole, as it evolves, as taxpayer behavior evolves, as simple and as easy to engage with as possible. And we set out a 10-year plan with the strong support of the Chancellor, I'm delighted to say, in the last few months, designed to achieve that. That's terrific. And of course, most recently, HMRC has been focused, and we very much welcome the scrutiny and the involvement of the OTS in relation to the programs that have been brought forward on COVID-19. And of course, as you will be aware, HMRC has really distinguished itself in many of those schemes: the furlough scheme, statutory sickness pay, some beat out the help out, you'll just have seen the self-employment scheme. It's a whole range of stuff. And we welcome further thinking and further engagement of the Office of Tax Simplification in that. Now, I touched on tax administration. Let me just spend a second longer on that. If we get that right, that's, I think, a really important and interesting future development for us, a kind of conditioning development. Of course, at the background, there's a lot of change to technology. That's important. Single customer references, taxpayer portal, that kind of work. Making tax digital, very important. I think a lot of the challenge there is about the smoothest possible transition as people go from the kind of systems they're using at the moment towards a much more integrated approach, much closer to real-time information. Possibly, we haven't yet, it's up for discussion, question about how and when people pay, what's the easiest way to pay tax given the different industry sectors that are affected by tax at different points in their own industry development. So that is a really interesting, I'd say, further frontier of discussion. And of course, the final point to mention is of course capital gains tax. It's an important part of the lives of some 300,000 people who pay it every year. It's achieved a certain amount of public attention, and it's quite a complex and difficult area, and therefore it is ripe for the incisive thinking and the expertise carefully deployed of the Office of Tax Simplification. And I thank you for taking that on, and I look forward very much to reading your findings and your results and discussing them through with you all. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in. I hope it's been a worthwhile start to the conference. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Financial Secretary. We very appreciate your comments. We've had a few questions raised, some of which are probably a bit more appropriate for later on. Perhaps the first one that I can start with is what's been asked is, what in your view are the hardest things from a government perspective about getting simplification improvements made?
Well, a very good question. I think, what do I think? I think there are so many different aspects to simplification, and the hardest thing often is working out how to trade off those political conflicts. Of course, you can have impediments to simplification at several different levels. You can have a political trade-offs we talked about; those are the ones that everyone kind of thinks about. You can have the desire to maintain equity across the system, and that can be a constraint on simplification. You can have concerns about revenue loss, that would be a constraint on simplification. And then you can have just the raw difficulty of actually encoding the text change and making sure that it, as it were, transmits itself through the system to people. I think it's hard to say in any particular case which is the hardest of those. The way I tend to see tax is very much, I don't know if you know that model of change Thomas Kuhn has in science, where you have this idea of the scientific revolutions, and what you have is a period of kind of working within an existing paradigm, existing framework, and then suddenly there's a change and a paradigm shift, and then everything suddenly changes, or a lot changes, and there can be radical simplification at that point. And famously in science, that would be, the moment when Newton cuts through Newtonian science, and then Einstein does the same thing, and now more recently with other theories of physics. I think we're not quite at that Ptolemaic point where that kind of resolution is required, but I do think that on the tax administration side, we will see tremendous scope for simplification because it'll be enabled by technology. And so it's a long answer to a question, but I hope that gives you some of the an insight into the kinds of ways I at least am thinking about this.
Thank you very much. I think one of the other questions that would be a good one to hear your views on is, what do you think our key measures of success should be so far as tax simplification is concerned? Certainly from your perspective, what are the things that we should be measuring ourselves by?
Well, I think that's, again, another very good question. Of course, the easy answer is to say, a budget in which a decisive simplification takes place as a result of advice proffered by OTS. I mean, that would be that's, as it were, the most obvious case. I think there are many other cases. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was very honoured and pleased to be able to consult with OTS in the course of thinking about some of the work we did on tax admin. A number of important and useful changes were made, not just to the strategy, but also the communication of the strategy, because that reflected that deeper understanding of that community of taxpayers. Obviously, we look forward to the OTS's self-generated, those moments where it thinks there is scope to make decisive simplification as well. I don't think there's a stable set of kind of specific things that we can say. It's rather like the fabled description of the elephant. We know what it looks like when we see one, but it's hard to describe in advance.
Thank you very much. And perhaps finally, one question that's been asked is about how easy is it to simplify a tax system if you don't have a very clear idea of the tax system's purpose and policy objectives? Do they need to be completely aligned for simplification to work?
I think that's, again, a really good question. Of course, it slightly depends on the nature of the simplification. If you are talking about a technical simplification, like the cash basis for change for unincorporated businesses, that's just a really sensible, wise idea, comes from deep understanding of the way in which a lot of people pay or might pay tax, make it easier for them. And what you do there is you do some consultation, and you need a lot of just expert work pouring through the detail and making that happen. That's one thing. If you're talking about, and I don't think you need to have a view for what the tax system should look like or how it should be in order to say that's a good idea. Now, if you're talking about some great wider simplification, then of course often it'll be done for straightforward fiscal or economic incentive reasons. And there, famously, of course, the Nigel Wilson budget, simplifying budget would be an example of a set of tax simplifications for political economic reasons rather than, as it were, for expert reasons. Now, did that represent a clear conception of what the tax system ought to be? I think in the regards that it operated, I don't think it did. I think it's a very rare politician who's got a fully, in any sense, detailed understanding of the full ramifications of the tax system and all its complexity. I think that requires the rabbinical genius of a lifetime of study, and that's why we have people like you, Catherine, and Bill, and David, to advise us.
Well, thank you very much for that, Financial Secretary. We're again very grateful for you joining us today. So thank you on behalf of the whole of the OTS and
my pleasure. And
colleagues.
Thank you very much indeed. And I hope you have a fantastic conference and everyone leaves just delighted with the conference itself, as well as by the performance of the OTS over the last 10 years. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to then move on to for us to hear from Bill Dodwell, the OTS Tax Director, who joined the OTS after a long career in tax in different places, and we are very grateful that he's with us. Bill, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's brilliant to be speaking at OTS conference, the second one I've been involved in on the panel, if you like, which is terrific. The first one being shot from my upstairs study, which is also good. So that hence the white background behind me. And indeed, it is a really pleasant thing to put on a tie. And hopefully soon, some of us will be able to appear back in the office more generally. I've got some slides which I hope will appear very shortly. Excellent. So this is roughly what I'm going to talk about. And by the way, if you want to tweet, please use the hashtag #OTS10 just to celebrate our sort of 10th year. But I thought I'd talk about the early years of the OTS, some of the significant projects, then cover what does simplification mean, because we do get that as a question. And it's clear there are one or two sort of different views on that, and it's worth debating that. And then sort of cover a little bit on recent and current work more generally, before sort of opening up the question, where next? I'd say right at the very start that the views and thoughts of taxpayers, of advisors, those in business, those in politics generally are all very helpful to us in helping us come up with better recommendations for change going forward. So please do feel free to contribute. The Q&A at the bottom, if you have the Zoom program, then please just use that to pose a question, and indeed, as Catherine said at the start, upvote the ones so that we can hopefully answer more of those later on. Let me move on to my first slide in the early years. And I was very pleased to find that the Financial Secretary just recognized the contribution of all the those involved with the Office of Tax Simplification. It of course started in 2010. It was a Conservative proposal, and I think we owe a great debt to our first tax director, John Whiting, pictured here sitting in the OTS office and reading one of the reports. I was struggling to enlarge the slide to see which one it was. No doubt John will tell me later on. But John did a fantastic job, because he obviously had to go into the start together with Jeremy Sherwood, who was the first head of office seconded from HMRC, to which he's now returned, by the way, and with Michael Jack's support. They had to get the OTS out of up and running, and had to build its credibility, and all credit to them for all the work they did. And I think John's work, together with obviously this very strong support of Parliament and the Treasury, then led to the statutory basis for the Office of Tax Simplification in 2016. It followed being made an sort of independent office of the Treasury in 2015. But the statutory basis sort of was important, because it meant for the first time we had a proper budget. So the result is that all the staff can get paid, which is frankly a pretty useful thing to do. And it means that we have this terrific mixture of skills gained in different places. So we have people from HMRC, we have people from the Treasury, and most importantly, we have people from the private sector, such as myself, obviously, and John and Paul. And it's the combination of those three sort of categories, if you like, that I think means that the OTS is capable of coming up with useful recommendations that can be adopted, can actually work, which is the most important thing when you do come up with recommendations. I'll go through some of the early reports in just a second, but let me also acknowledge Paul Morton, who was tax director from 2017 to 2019. Some people may not know, I actually joined the OTS as a team member, a policy advisor, in 2018 when I retired from Deloitte, and started off working for Paul. And it was only a few months later that he decided that he was going to move on to other things, which gave me the opportunity I applied for and was fortunate enough to obtain. Paul had a very special angle. I think probably technology is the biggest single contribution Paul made to the OTS, and that of course has just been covered by the Financial Secretary. Jeremy Sherman did his 5 years and returned to HMRC, which is great. He has been succeeded by our current head of office, David Halsey. Again, a tax inspector, former policy specialist, all sorts of things within HMRC, and it's David who managed, and Jeremy before him, who managed the staff team. So, thanks very much to that. And our previous chairs, Michael Jack and Angela Knight, both politicians, of course. And I think it's a great sign of maturity that, we're now able to sort of move out from that political shelter, if you like. And our current chair, Catherine Kearns, is of course not a politician. That's probably not, and obviously nor have any of the tax directors or the officials been, and that's probably a really good idea. Let's just talk about some of the significant projects. The Financial Secretary mentioned the review of tax release. It was the sort of first report that the OTS actually got involved in. And the headline, if you like, was that it proposed the abolition of 50 or so not very necessary tax reliefs, and in the end about 44 of them or 43 of them disappeared. But what was actually the most important thing that John Whiting and the team managed through all of this was the list and categorization of reliefs. It was the first time in which all the UK tax reliefs were actually spelt out, and I think that's a really massive achievement. It leads to lots and lots of questions even today, where lots of people send us emails saying, so what are you doing on tax reliefs? And the answer is nothing. Today, that role has passed to people such as the Public Accounts Committee, the National Audit Office, and most importantly, of course, HMRC and the Treasury more generally. So it was good to kick that off. The other really unusual type of report was when Chancellor George Osborne asked the OTS to review the competitiveness of UK tax administration. And it was really trying to see what could be done to improve the UK's rankings in the sort of World Bank rankings of easy to do business places. And I certainly recall John Whiting's line that unless the UK became a sort of petro economy, different days now, of course, but unless the UK had a sort of single source of revenue like that, it was really hard to make a massive change in tax administration more generally. But it was an interesting and unusual contribution. It's worth just ploughing through the OTS website and just to see the wide range of reports that really have been produced over the years. There have been several about, the base for income tax and national insurance. There have been, discussions about possible mergers and that sort of thing. The last report there really highlighted some of the massive challenges that took place in that area with, 7 million winners and 7 million losers or something of that sort of order of magnitude, and a process that would take up to 5 years, it was estimated, to get there. So, you know, with those challenges, it perhaps wasn't surprising that the then Chancellor, Philip Hammond, responded that thanks, but we're not going there just at the moment on that particular one. There's also reviews of taxation of pensioners, a sort of important theme. And, you know, I saw one of the questions that came up was, you know, should we be making the state pension subject to pay as you earn? And you may know that about 12 million people receive the state pension. About half those, about 6 million, actually pay some tax. The other half don't. And that's probably why we don't have a pay-as-you-earn system at this stage. But there's no doubt it does not having the ability to withhold tax from the state pension does make life more complicated for some pensioners more generally. It's worth keeping an eye on that group more as we go forward. There have been a lot of reports about employment status, the gig economy, and the role of technology. Paul Morton was commissioned a report on technology, a really important own initiative report, that one. And it sort of asked, you know, some of the more difficult questions about, you know, the role of the taxpayer, where technology became more capable of filling in gaps. And it's worth continuing to bear that sort of question in mind. What is responsibility in the age of the machine more generally? We were pleased to pick up the taxation of the gig economy with a report we produced last October 2019 on reporting and paying tax for self-employed people and landlords, which is a slightly long and cumbersome title. But it was really about that sort of, you know, how do we make it easier for particularly self-employed people, particularly middle and low incomes, to report and pay their tax more generally? And one of the recommendations for that was something that's turned into the single digital account in the recent tax administration strategy as released by the Financial Secretary, HMRC, and the Treasury. I probably should have moved my slide on a bit with a sort of few more lists of some of these things. The cash basis has definitely been covered already. It now applies to about 1 million people. It probably shows again how the OTS has worked. Report was done, it recommended the adoption of the cash basis. It was set at a sort of £30,000 level. And the idea was to make it simple for somebody who provided labour-only services to report their income for tax purposes, pay tax much more straightforwardly. It was adopted and expanded quite significantly, and now applies by election to people with income up to £150,000. Again, it's probably best suited for primarily labour businesses. It doesn't work if you run a retail shop or, you know, you have large amounts of debtors and creditors. But it is a really popular way of reporting and paying tax. And so, you know, the initial work done by the OTS led to the ability for HMRC and the Treasury to take it forward and turn it into a sort of bigger concept more generally, and then apply it to landlords reporting as well. And it's that sort of thing you can see will make making tax digital for income tax much easier. Those people will find that more straightforward than those using, you know, slightly more complicated accounting with accruals basis and that sort of thing more generally. I was pleased to see the Financial Secretary remembered the VAT review. This was produced in November 2017. But some of the recommendations are still being worked through. So we saw consultation documents recently come out on some aspects of all of that. The initial point was, frankly, ask the question, should we reduce the registration threshold? Because it's the highest in the EU and clearly acts as an element of distortion. The challenge, I guess, for moving it downwards is that it would make life quite difficult for those in that sort of caught in the trap there more generally. We're proud of our two reviews on inheritance tax, two reports, sorry. The first looked at administration, the second looked at policy. We're still to hear from the Chancellor as to how he is going to respond to those particular reviews. It's probably entirely fair that he should take some time, because after all, they weren't commissioned by our current Chancellor. And he's had one or two other things on his mind more generally. But we do hope to see both improvements in administration and additionally some of the policy changes we put forward taken forward more generally. We did them in sort of packages, and the idea behind that was overall to produce a framework that was easier for taxpayers to understand and easier for those thinking about, you know, I shall be dying at some future date. What would happen for leaving my estate to my children, you know, and other people related more generally. So trying to find a better framework to make that more understandable to people was really important to us. But to do so in a context that said, let's put together a package of different things which would work together well, and between them sort of share the, if you like, the exchequer cost. So one thing was, why didn't we shorten that 7-year before death period for where you add on gifts to 5 years, because that would make it easier administratively, but you need to pay for that a bit. So let's get rid of taper relief, which no one, unless they're an inheritance tax specialist, understands how it works. So that's what led to all of that more generally. So that's a sort of, you know, important thing. Reporting and paying tax, again, it was a sort of short scoping type of review. The biggest single thing was how important having a single digital account would be for all taxpayers. So merging the personal tax account and the business tax account, having it as an easy way to record information. So if you make an election, having it appear in your personal tax account this year and next year and so on, so we all know about it. Having it to be the hub for sort of making, you know, any form of tax filing more generally. So a really helpful thing, and to say we were delighted to see that being taken forward by HMRC in the tax administration strategy generally. The second aspect was to ask, could third parties help low and middle income taxpayers with their reporting and indeed possible paying tax obligations? And we think in some cases they could. In areas where there are, you know, it's common to have an intermediary, and the sort of two examples given were the area of private hire taxes, mini cabs, whatever, where almost everyone provides their service through an intermediary. If that intermediary reported income to HMRC and that appeared magically in the individual's single digital account, it would certainly make their compliance more straightforward and help them more generally, which would be a good thing. And the same applies possibly with sort of holiday accommodation as well, where again, very common to find that that's provided to people who want to stay in it through intermediaries more generally. Now, let me move on to our next thing and sort of talk a little bit about the two things. Well, sorry, let me first talk about the aspects of simplification. I think the point I really want to make here, this isn't just about better forms or better guidance or pre-population, all of which are great things. We have actually got to think in a sort of bigger way, I think, to make our tax system simpler whilst meeting the other objectives that taxpayers and ministers really have for all of it overall. So legislation with a better scheme, understandable by taxpayers, has to be really important. But removing distortions or reducing the distortions and reducing confusing choice is actually another objective in getting to a simpler system. So a distortion is something that leads you, away from your natural choice that you were going to do, to doing something because there's a tax benefit of doing it in a sort of unnatural fashion. An example of that is you were going to give something away during your lifetime because you wanted beneficiary to have it now, but you didn't because there would be a step up to market value for capital gains tax purposes when you died. So that's an example of a distortion in the system, and finding a means of improving all of that I think does lead to a simpler and better overall tax system. And choice is a mixture, of things. There's good choices, and there's, the opportunity for choices that lead people down the rabbit hole of avoidance. And we've seen from the past that, that is really bad news. Lots of people have been really badly affected by avoidance. It takes over their lives. That's not really what anybody wants through all of that. So 2 quick words about our next, the studies we're working on, and then I will finish and hand over to Jill Rutter. So the next slide, I think, talks about, let's see which order we've got them in, our review of capital gains tax. And, this is important just to draw your attention to the fact that, this is the letter to us from the Chancellor. And in particular, the Chancellor is interested in our views generally where present rules can distort behaviour or don't meet their policy intent. And it's worth thinking about that and whether we can help simplify the tax system by identifying areas there. Obviously, all these decisions very much go back to ministers and the Treasury. That's a vital part of, at least for me, how I see the sort of democracy of taxation generally. But having us being able to take advice from a wide range of taxpayers and advisors generally, turn them into recommendations and take that forward, I hope will make a sort of positive impact for how we take forward this particular tax and indeed other taxes more generally. Our final area is on the next slide. We're looking at claims and elections. I talked right at the start, the very first report was, identifying all the reliefs. Almost every relief in the UK needs a claim to get it. And we're having to ask the question, do we really need all of that? And that's what all this is about. We hope to publish a report in the autumn. It's great to sort of slip into Treasury speak there. I sort of think that means October, November. So hopefully you'll see something of that. And again, some worthwhile recommendations to make life easier to get the reliefs and make the elections that are specifically set out by Parliament more generally. So my time is up. That sort of covered everything I was going to cover, and very much look forward to hearing from as many people as possible on what you'd like us to look forward next. With that, let me hand over to Jill Rutter.
I'm just going to briefly introduce Jill and say to thank her again for taking part in this. As I said, she's a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, and I should just mention that she's a co-author of Better Budgets, a joint publication in 2017 from the IFG, the IFS, and the Chartered Institute of Taxation on better tax policy making, which Bill was also involved in, I think, as a co-author. Thank you very much, Jill.
Thank you very much. Am I okay now? It says you've muted me. Catherine, have you unmuted? Is that okay?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
You're fine. We can hear you.
Good. Sorry, everybody. The perils of Zoom presentations, as always. Blank, you're muted is the sort of message of the summer, I think. So as Catherine said, I'm delighted to be here, and happy birthday to the OTS. It's great you're still around. The provocation from Bill to me when he asked me to do this, and as Catherine said, Bill and I co-wrote the IFG's first outing into tax policy making, Better Budgets, and I then, with my colleagues Gemma Tetlow, Tom Pope and Joe Marshall, wrote a report that was out in the last year. I can't quite remember when, it all seems a blur, on how to approach tax reform. I'm going to draw on both of those, but I just wanted to think a bit about the OTS. I think it's quite interesting if you go back to 2010, which seems like many lifetimes ago, but if you go back to 2010, the OTS was set up then, but it was part of a sort of twin package of reforms introduced by the incoming Chancellor, George Osborne, and the coalition with the Office for Budget Responsibility. But I think you might say that of the two sort of, George Osborne creations children, the OBR was given a rather sort of better start in life. If you look at that, the OTS had to wait to be put on a statutory basis. The OBR was put into legislation in 2010. and immediately given its own ring-fenced budget. That was part of the recommendation from the Treasury Select Committee. It indeed has a unique set of arrangements to establish its independence from the Treasury, agreed with the Treasury Select Committee. The OBR has established a very clear public profile. I think it's now part of the furniture. The OBR is something that everybody, most commentators have heard of and knows. It's relatively well resourced, and it's a critical part of the budget process. The OTS, we thought that, then Chancellor sort of didn't really see the full potential of. It wasn't put on a statutory basis until 2016. It's very light on resources. It was just sort of basically a few people sitting in a building in the Treasury. The OBR made it very clear there was no way they were going to sit in the Treasury building. It had quite a low profile, outings among tax specialists. I note that there are 190 so people on this call, all of whom know more about tax than me, all of whom will have heard of the OTS, of course, but I'm not sure if we went and polled people outside, that many people would yet have heard of the OTS. And I think the most interesting thing, and what Bill asked me to address in this talk today, was its very limited remit. Its remit was to look at simplification of the existing tax system. And most notably, it was cut out of any direct involvement in the budget process. If you go back to the legislation says the OTS must provide advice to the Chancellor of the Exchequer on request or as the OTS considers appropriate. I think that's very useful, that the OTS can do things on its own initiative, doesn't have to wait for the Chancellor to ask, on the simplification of the tax system. But I think that's a problem. Clearly, simplification is an incredibly important issue for the reasons that the Financial Secretary and Bill have all set out. It adds to business compliance costs, it adds to deadweight costs, makes the tax system inefficient, it encourages the wrong sort of behaviours, so rent-seeking behaviours. So I think it's very important that as we look to where next for the next 10 years, the next decades of the OTS, you do not give up on your mission to simplify. But I think we might want to look in two directions for some reforms of the OTS if we're looking going forward. I think a clear finding from that report that Bill mentioned, the first really big OTS report on reliefs back in 2011, is there's a huge asymmetry in tax policy. It is very easy for chancellors to introduce tax reliefs. Indeed, if you want to do something in a budget and you want to get a positive headline from an interest group, the easiest thing you can do is to introduce some sort of relief. As Bill said, people have to then know about it and claim it, and those behavioural effects are quite hard to judge. But it's very, very easy to introduce new reliefs. Those, of course, add to the complexity of the system. But it's much harder once you get those reliefs or you tweak the system to get rid of them. Because the effect of any of those reliefs or tweaks the tax system is you create a very specific class of beneficiaries. And those people always have a much more vested interest in keeping that relief, that tweak that was designed to meet their very specific circumstances, than the whole generality of the tax-paying public who will benefit from simplification. And that is the basic political economy of tax, that you have a narrow but very vocal and very active group of losers, and no one really, other than the OTS, the Treasury, when it's being very high-minded, as an economic department, who are there to act as advocates for the mass of general taxpayers and the interests of a simpler tax system. So I think if we looked anywhere for the first reform, you might want to look at the OTS going forward, is a first do no harm principle, which says actually before we set the poor OTS that sort of myth of Sisyphus task of tax simplification, why not give it a remit to ensure that chancellors at least have to jump over a bigger hurdle in giving in, before they give in to the inevitable temptation to make the tax system more complicated. The ODS pushes the boulder uphill, only to find that the Chancellor in budget after budget is sending loads more boulders down onto its head. So that's my first suggestion for the OTS, is play that role. What is quite interesting, if you give the OTS a clear role in scrutinising tax proposals in the budget to see if they run counter to the simplification objective, is that that would actually introduce a bit of grit into the mill that the Treasury has been very, very happy to introduce for other policies. If you work in a department other than the policy and you use regulation rather than tax as one of your key instruments, you will find that you have to jump over the hurdle of a Bayes committee called the Regulatory Policy Committee, which will gaily rank your proposal green, amber or red to say whether actually your measure is justified. But the Regulatory Policy Committee has no role on tax, despite tax repeatedly coming top of any survey you have on how does government create burdens for business. And I think developing this budget role for the OTS would supplement the OBR role. The OBR makes sure that the Treasury is getting its numbers right, but doesn't comment on the merits of any tax proposal. I think the Treasury should now be much more relaxed on bringing the undoubted expertise that the OTS is building up to look at actually, is this really a good way of doing things? So that's my first proposal for that. None of that stops ministers from doing what they want, but introduces a bit more grit into the oyster. Exactly the role actually that the Treasury often plays about other departments' proposals, but the Treasury is perhaps a bit more reluctant to play on its own. It could propose ways of achieving the same objective with less complexity. The discipline for the Chancellor will be that the views of the OTS, its own assessment, will be published alongside the budget. That's actually one of the roles that some of the tax specialist bodies, the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Institute of Chartered Accountants, others play for the Treasury Select Committee. And the aim will be quite simple, to make the Chancellor think twice before further complicating the tax system. But I think there's a second question about whether this is time, as the OTS moves into its teenage years, to gain a bigger role entirely. And I think the CGT report that Bill mentioned is very interesting. I'm also quite intrigued as to whether Bill and others can actually work out what on earth the policy intent is behind capital gains tax at the moment, but we will see if they can find any statement. One of the things that's very complicated about tax policy making in this country is how hard it is in many cases to discern actually what the policy objective is, which obviously then makes the evaluation much more difficult. And if I was going more widely, I might add tax policy evaluation as a third arm of OTS reform. But I'm not going to go there quite yet. I'm going to suggest that over time, the OTS might morph into the OTR, the Office for Tax Reform. One of the things that when we were doing better budgets, colleagues inside government said was that they were worried about the poor state of public debate on the tax system. And as the IFG's recent report on tax reform showed, the very poor state of public knowledge generally, a poor state of public knowledge that frankly extends to those very representative of people, members of parliament, because they reflect quite a lot of public unknowing about the tax system, about fundamental things like the income distribution. The debate about tax policy is too impoverished in this country. You could say that the IFS, in a sense, has grown into this big monopoly, which has basically withered away all the competition. You can see people from the IFS, well, I could do if I could see the squeaking in the audience, but anyway. But it's very clear, even before COVID, we face a very big future fiscal challenge, the one that former and permanent Secretary to the Treasury, Nick Macpherson, used to summarise as the UK population basically wants Scandinavian services for US taxes. And it's not just Scandinavian services now, it's Scandinavian services for an ageing population. One of the big lessons of COVID is I think we're going to have to get used to a bigger, more resilient state. And if you just look at one of the things, that I'm just not sure we're going to go on with an underfunded social care system. Some very big gaps are emerging on the spending side, but there are also some very big gaps set to emerge on the tax side. if you look, for instance, at fuel duties, as we move, as we will, the government has phased a target date for phase out of petrol and diesel car sales of 2035. That will mean the cash cow, even the slightly flat cash cow following years, will absolutely one of the things that we need to do, but how do we invest the analysis many 40 years system? Because too often people's minds whenever
I'm very sorry. I think we've lost Jill. I think she probably had technology problems, which means that we've lost her. So I'm very sorry about that. I think she had got quite close to the end of what she was proposing to say, and hopefully she'll be able to dial back in again for the following session. I'm very pleased to introduce Emma Agyemang from the Financial Times, who writes on tax for it. And also joining her for a panel session are Lindsay White, who's the HM Treasury Director of Personal Tax, Welfare and Pensions, and Ruth Stanier from HMRC, Director General for Customer Strategy and Tax Design, who's also a member of the OTS board. And also Bill, and I hope Jill, if she comes back online, will be able to join in with the Q's and A's. So Emma, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks very much for having me on this panel, which especially at such a interesting and sort of challenging time for the UK economy, from the UK tax system. I always think, I've been covering tax for the last couple of years at the FT, and initially when I started and mentioning to people as a tax expert, their first reaction was, oh, not so good. But I think the joke's been on them, because tax, the fact that tax is fascinating, I think, is one of the world's best kept secrets. And certainly over the last couple of years, it hasn't been a quiet moment. It hasn't been, it hasn't been a dull moment in tax. So I think we're only going to get more of that. And certainly the work of the OTS, whenever we write up the reports the OTS has done, Bill mentioned the one on inheritance tax, obviously this recent review into CGT, often they're some of the most well-read articles on our sites that day. And that's not just across personal finance, that's across, just the FT generally. So there is interest and appetite for tax, which I think is going to be even more going up the agenda as we think about what happens next. So the OTS's sort of 10-year anniversary in some ways couldn't be more timely. So just I wanted to respond on some of the few things that have been discussed already from relatively layman's perspective. I think it's very interesting what Jill was saying, unfortunately, before she got cut off, about thinking about a sort of broader role for the OTS, and in terms of ways in which the remit for what tax is for, and thinking about tax principles maybe, and also just making the scrutiny of the development of tax policy. I would support that as somebody writing about tax, because it does seem to be that compared to other areas of policy, first of all, public understanding is not necessarily that strong in terms of understanding how individual taxes work, but the whole tax system as a whole. And then when it comes to the impact that tax policy has on individuals, so I mean, we've seen a couple of examples in recent years in terms of areas in which tax difficulties happened. For example, the loan charge, and a couple of people have mentioned in Q&A, IR35. These are obviously very complicated areas, and I think that I would welcome the idea of the OTS being more of a, in the future, or working towards bringing its expertise, offering an independent, as Jill was saying, hi Jill, by the way, in terms of yeah, having an authoritative voice that's independent. I think that could be a way for you to go. And just as well in terms of the continuing complexity of the UK's tax system, because despite all the the great work, and Bill mentioned all the various reports, it is still true that the UK has one of the longest tax codes in the world. So I suppose maybe sort of thinking about actually why that is, and what can be done so that in 10 years' time, arguably we're not going to be in the same position. That's kind of just something to put out there. Yeah, and then finally, in terms of, the Financial Secretary was mentioning the tax administration strategy, which I think is actually very welcome development, thinking about things from a long-term perspective about how it works. And that would be a good thing to replicate, but I'm intrigued about and sort of also anxious about, the push towards digitalisation could also lead to certain groups being excluded, certain sorts of, types of people not being able to access the tax system or being detrimentally affected by it. So I'd also, like to hopefully pick up in the discussions later on. So as Catherine's mentioned, I'm going to be taking questions from the audience and sort of relaying them to the panel, but just wanted to put a few thoughts of my own out there as well. I'm now going to pass on to Ruth.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased also to be taking part in today's really important event representing HMRC. And I think it's great that we're all getting together today to mark this important milestone of 10 years for the OTS. Making it as easy as possible to get tax right is a very important priority for HMRC and an area where we know we have more to do. And this is also, of course, a really important theme right at the centre of our new 10-year strategy to build a trusted modern tax administration system. The vision there is to work towards a tax administration system which works closer to real time, so that people can get their tax right with ease as they go about living their daily lives and as businesses undertake their business affairs on a day-to-day basis. And the strategy very much draws on learning from all of our experience in recent months of rising to the challenge of the COVID-19 situation, and also very much takes account of the pace of societal change, which is very relevant to our discussions today. So from my perspective, the OTS really do play an incredibly important and valued role in providing independent advice on simplification, on ease from a tax administration perspective. And I think the way in which the OTS are able to draw on very, very wide input from, I'm sure, everyone who's joined this session today, but also much more widely into all users, many users of the tax system, really adds weight and value to their recommendations and findings. It's been great today to shine a light on so many areas where it's clear that the OTS have had significant impact over the years. I'd add to some of the examples that have already been brought out to say that, I'm in no doubt that OTS work really has an impact across the full range of policy and process issues that we're considering within HMRC. I mean, the OTS guidance report, for example, really helped build momentum for many of the improvements that we're in the process of putting in place there, including greater use of interactive guidance, which can help people find the specific answer they need more quickly. It's also the case, as Bill has brought out, that I think the OTS's influence is very, very plain and clear to see in our new 10-year strategy. So I very much look forward to continuing to work with Bill and the whole OTS team, and also with many others as we work to deliver the 10-year strategy in practice. Thank you. And I'll pass now to Lindsay.
Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm on a slightly different Zoom access to others, so I hope it's working. Can you hear me? I can see you still, Ruth.
We can hear you.
Excellent, yep. Great. I think my video might have frozen in a particularly unflattering pose at the moment if my screen's anything to go by, but I'm going to style it out and carry on. I'm the director in the Treasury for personal tax and also sort of welfare and pensions. I've been doing this for nearly 3 years now. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to be with you today. I know that Beth Russell, who's the Director General in the Treasury for Tax and Welfare, would very much have liked to be here to help celebrate your anniversary. But she is in fact appearing before the Public Accounts Committee at the moment, talking, I believe, about tax relief, so very relevant. But I wanted to start off just by congratulating everybody at the OTS over the last 10 years for everything that you've achieved, and to wish you all a very happy birthday. As the Financial Secretary sort of set out in opening this conference, simplification is really important for ministers, and I've certainly seen that very strongly over the last 8 months, where a lot of what I've been involved with, working very closely with teams in HMRC, have been the development of the big schemes to respond to the pandemic. So the development of the job retention scheme and the self-employed income support scheme. And it was really clear right from the start of those processes how imperative it was that those programs were able to be delivered quickly. So they needed to be very simple in terms of HMRC's ability to build and run the systems, but also really importantly that businesses and individuals had to be able to interact with them in a very clear and easy way. And it's really shone a light on that, because we're facing a context where for many businesses and individuals it's the worst experience that they might ever have, and this is a time where government really has to step in to provide that support. And I think that's really, like, ministers have been really clear throughout that process about how important simplicity is, and that's definitely fed through to the 10-year strategy and the longer term commitment on making tax digital and everything that Ruth and others have talked about there. Now, of course, it's obviously much easier when you're starting from scratch with brand new programs like that to start from that principle and to design it on the basis of that principle of simplicity and speed. Of course, it's a lot harder when you're dealing with a complicated existing system, and as Bill kind of talked through really thoughtfully earlier on, you've got to think through the transition processes that you need, and you've got to think through how you support the parts of the population that are perhaps adversely affected by moves that would simplify the system for others. But I think, as everybody else on this conference has said, I think the OTS has had a really transformative impact, and that has grown over its 10 years in really bringing the sort of strong arguments and strong sort of policy options around simplification to bear in the process. And there are, of course, lots of examples of where recommendations have been taken on that people have talked to already. But I would also say that even in areas where it hasn't yet been possible to make some of those changes, or other factors have weighed in the opposite direction that ministers have to take account from, we're still looking at these reports very regularly. So in my area, for example, the income tax and NICS report is so relevant to a whole span of policy issues that we are interested in. All of the work around the Good Work Plan, all of the thinking about different ways of working, just to name a couple. And I think one of the real strengths about the OTS's approach is that because the reports carry real weight, and the sort of consultation process that has gone through and the sort of broad range of expertise that is brought to bear means that they also have real longevity. So certainly all three of the chancellors that I've worked with in this role, and all of the financial secretaries, have always wanted to go back and understand what the OTS have said at different points over the last several years when they've thought about policy development. So lots of these reports remain really live, and they certainly really impact the way that we think about giving our advice to ministers. So I mean, that's just really welcome. I was going to just pick up particularly, I think, Jill was talking about some really interesting ideas about how you might extend the OTS's challenge and sort of direct role in the policy making process. I mean, that's obviously, of course, a question for ministers. Anything to do with changing the remit would be for ministers. But as the FST was talking about earlier on in the conference, it's a really interesting question, and ministers remain really interested in how we continue to develop and evolve the tax policy making process. But I think it is worth thinking in that just about how we can make sure that it is the value that the OTS brings from that public engagement and real expertise is preserved in that. And that can be something that's a little bit harder to do with sensitive kind of budget policies in the development. But it's a really interesting set of challenges, and it's really great to be able to be part of this discussion, and very much look forward to the sort of Q&A session that we can go into now. But just to say thanks very much again for having me, and a very happy anniversary to all at the OTS. Thanks very much. I think I'm passing back to Emma to compare the rest of this session.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. No, great to hear from you. So we do have quite a few questions, and I thought it'd be good for us to kind of try and group some of them together and pull some out. So we're getting quite a few questions about some of the consultations, maybe and recommendations that the OTS has made and haven't yet been acted on. So there was one which was about small business. Trying to find that one, I can't find it many, but I remember seeing it, and some other ones. And so I think that, maybe my question is to Bill and Catherine, just do you have a list of all the things that the OTS has recommended, and do you sort of keep track of what's been responded on in terms of governments, the governments come back to you on, just because because you are doing such good work as lots of people have attested to, just in terms of making it easier to understand what you've done and what's been reacted to?
Well, thank you for that. It's one of the hardest single questions because we are an independent body. We make recommendations, but ultimately those decisions are indeed for the Chancellor, ministers, the Financial Secretary, no doubt, and the Treasury. So we've got to have the best recommendations you possibly can, and we've got to help make the case for why they should be sensible and workable and be adopted. And that means, I think, working with a range of people at HMRC, because frankly, HMRC has a unique perspective on the operation of the tax system, so we really have to involve them. The Treasury, of course, because their perspective very much on the policy making, together with taxpayers, because it's a combined case that really needs to be made. Under Catherine's chairmanship, we have started doing reviews of some of the past areas that we've done reports on. So our first review was on VAT. It sort of said, so what's happened since November 2017? And the answer was something, but not enough in terms of the report generally. And we've most recently done a sort of review of what's happened in the areas of corporation tax, personal service companies, employment. So, those are sort of worthwhile things, I think, to take forward more generally. But ultimately, we're going to have to ask ministers, what can we do to make our reports more useful, more easy to adopt more generally, and see what we can best do in that sort of area.
Okay. And just because, it's the top question from Anita Monteith, which is about it's about changing the date of a tax year, because I think the UK is unique in having its tax year start on the 6th of April, end on the 5th of April, and she's asking if we could change that so it coincides with a calendar month end. What's your sense about that? Is that something that's come up before?
I believe it has come up before, but I think it would be best to ask Ruth Stanier or Lindsay White to give some comment on that, because moving it to a different date is presumably a huge operational change. And I think there's also, at least the possibility in terms of government accounting for what would we do with a sort of 5 days worth of revenue if we move, let's say, from 6th April back to 1st April. You know, would we sort of lose some money in the government accounts? I know over the period of time you don't, but that's not how we actually make our numbers add up. So I don't know if Lindsay or Ruth would like to. I see Ruth is ready to give us some comment on that area. What do you say?
Well, Lindsay may well also want to come in, but just to say from my perspective, I've been watching the question and the reactions to it with some interest in the chat. So many thanks, Anita, for raising it. I mean, it would, of course, as Bill sets out, be a not insignificant change by any means, and not something that we're actively pursuing at the present time. But certainly I shall take back to colleagues the fact that it's been raised as an issue in this way today. But Lindsay, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I mean, just to agree, it's a really interesting question. It isn't one that we've sort of talked to ministers about, certainly during my time in this role. I think, I mean, the thing that we'd need to really think through is whether the sort of benefit of doing that in terms of aligning with others and simplification was, you know, that outweighed the cost, not just to HMRC of the sort of significant operational changes, but also for sort of businesses and taxpayers, and making sure we'd understood what was going to be the sort of operational impact for them as well. But it's, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and definitely one to think about.
Yeah, and I think it's also telling because, you know, on the surface it sounds like quite a simple change, but, you know, as you've all pointed out, the knock-on impact to, you know, changing people's, you know, internal, you know, computer systems, everything, businesses. So it kind of highlights the difficulties with simplification that maybe we've sort of touched on. I'd just like to go on to another sort of theme that I'm guessing through some of the questions. So the sort of next popular question is from John Andrews, and he's asking, to what extent should the OTS be involved in assisting HMRC to design self-help solutions for unrepresented taxpayers to reduce and eliminate innocent errors? And I think later on there's some other questions about, you know, what can the OTS do in helping taxpayers become more, you know, understanding how the tax system works in terms of explaining how tax works. So maybe that might be one for Catherine or Bill.
I'm happy to have a first stab and feel sure for others can contribute too. First thing to say is we're a relatively small team at the OTS. There's about 12 or so of us. So we have to sort of influence rather than spend our time doing lots of very detailed work on how exactly you would improve things. So it's important to identify good solutions and then sort of discuss them at the top, but the actual implementation is something that we're not really staffed to do. Now, you may say we ought to be. That's a perfectly fair point, but we would need to change the nature of the office as it currently stands if we were to get into more detailed implementation more generally. But I think the overall mission of the Office of Tax Simplification is very much to help taxpayers. And the majority of taxpayers, let's just say, I mean, I occasionally speak to, you know, audiences of large companies, and the answer is you're not our target market. If simplification can benefit large companies as well as other ones, that's great, but our target market is the largest numbers. So it's individual taxpayers, particularly those in business, particularly those facing particular challenges at points in their lifetime. So our report last year on sort of, you know, taxpayer life cycle was a really interesting and important report because it looked at sort of key events during an individual's life and, you know, how tax could affect them adversely and in a complex way to deal with all of that. So that very much is our mission. We clearly accept it. It's not just about unrepresented taxpayers, but they're very much at the sort of heart of what we will try and do. Yes.
Okay. And then I've also been getting a few people tweeting me, and I think a couple of questions in the Q&A as well, asking about employment status in particular. IR35, which is a complicated area of tax. Is that something, I mean, just because I don't know, I mean, is that something the OTS has looked at in the past, or something that you might think about, you know, basically figuring out the difficulties around employment status?
I think employment status remains one of the tricky areas of UK taxation generally. And the reason it's a tricky area is sort of twofold. The first is that we have huge pressure on the difference between self-employed and employed people due to the huge difference in national insurance primarily, but also possibly other taxes as well. If you didn't have that massive difference, then you wouldn't have such sort of importance of people frankly trying to get into the lower tax paying bracket through all of that. So that's where we start. And then we have the complexity of trying to take a whole mixture of ancient tax case law and derive some principles from it and apply those generally. And for me, at least, that is not a particularly good way to define a boundary and trying to work forward from it. So personally, I think there's two solutions needed. The first is to look at that whole difference in massive taxation, national insurance principally, between self-employed and employed people, see what can be done there. That's very much a sort of issue for the Chancellor. It's an issue, of course, the Chancellor referred to when he introduced the self-employed income support scheme. That it would be necessary to visit that in the future, and we'll see what the Chancellor chooses to do there. On the definition, I think the view that we've put forward, certainly I put it forward at the House of Lords Finance Bill Subcommittee, was that we should consult, we as a country should consult on introducing a statutory definition, and it shouldn't be a codification of the existing case law. It should be actually deciding what did we want to be defined in that sort of way. So I think I'd recommend taking that forward. The OTS has done some reports on this in the past. It's probably fair to say they've not moved massively. This is such a big area that yeah, you know, it'd be good to see some movement in the future.
Sure. And Ruth, I can see you're off mute. Did you want to add something to that?
Oh, not particularly. I was just thinking this might come to me. And I think from my perspective, I mean, this clearly is a challenging area. Given the COVID situation, implementation of the off payroll working rules in the private sector has been pushed back into next April. We're really grateful for all the work that's been done to prepare for implementation, and it's given us a little bit more time to do a bit of further work where that was needed. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. And Jill, I mean, sort of picking up on something that you said previously about, you know, the OTS maybe becoming the OTR in terms of tax reform, and what kind of things would you like the OTR if you could magically magic up more money for them to expand into this area? What kind of things would you like to see them sort of be able to get into?
Well, I think this employment status thing is really, really interesting, because when Philip Hammond introduced his proposals to sort of equalise NICs a bit, you know, he got support from the IFS, he got support from Torsten Bell and the Resolution Foundation, and within a week had to withdraw the proposal because he couldn't get it through Parliament. And I think that was a very classic example of very inadequate pitch rolling, because the sort of data that HMRC and the Treasury have on who actually are the people who are the potential beneficiaries is very different from the sort of characterization in the press of who were the potential beneficiaries. So I think that would be an area, though I know it's very sensitive, because I think, didn't people latch on some OTS report about NICs saying this was absolutely disgraceful proposal, which basically cost people a cappuccino a week or something like that, and it really wasn't huge amounts of money involved for quite a big simplification. So I do think there's that's the sort of issue. I thought actually the Treasury suffered very badly on that. Don't expect Lindsay to comment, from failing to link it into the Taylor review of wider employment status, because actually I think the Treasury does itself by insisting on looking at it in its tax box and not relating it to wider issues of benefits, legal rights and things like that when you want to do those sorts of things. So I think those sorts of issues are ones which are quite slow burn, where a lot of public engagement is quite useful. I think the OT really good stuff on public engagement, which is very useful to sort of build on, to sort of get people's views in, because we don't actually nearly enough. And actually that's partly when I was in the Treasury, the idea we'd have set up an independent, say anything about tax was just absolutely appalling. I mean, we sort of, completely hated the thoughts of that sort of thing. So I think, we've come away, but I think there's a way further. Intrigued, actually, as an OTS topic by some of the comments in the Q&A about when is taxpayer choice, because a choice is only an effective choice if people are informed enough to use it. Otherwise, unfairness between the informed and advised versus the uninformed and under-advised, maybe be real. I think those sorts of issues are really interesting, difficult ones to comment on. So yeah, I think they could define a very interesting work program going forward, but with more resources.
Yes, absolutely. Well, actually, you mentioned the issue of building choice within the tax system and the difficulties that kind of necessitates, even though choice is normally a good thing. Helen Thornley has a good question. I think if the ultimate aim of HMRC is for taxpayers to do more online, should we be drafting more digital-friendly legislation? As she explains, that's legislation that follows decision trees that can be more easily programmed. I mean, I don't know how difficult or easy that would be from a sort of IT legislation perspective. Maybe Lindsay or Ruth could let us know what you think.
I'm happy to come in. I think it's a fantastic question, and really the work that we've now committed to as part of the 10-year strategy to modernise and update the overall tax administration legislative framework is exactly in this area. It's thinking afresh about how we get a tax code that's genuinely fit for the modern technological systems that we now need to be running. So I think the question is bang on the money, and something that we very much need to work on together. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pass it to Catherine.
Thank you very much to Emma, Lindsay, Ruth, Jill and Bill for all their contributions. We are now coming towards the end of the webinar. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm very sorry we didn't get to tackle more questions, but they will all go into the pot as far as we're concerned. And we may well want to follow up on them because they've all been extremely good questions and show great engagement from all of those who've attended this. So thank you very much indeed. I do hope we'll be able to do it again. But meanwhile, I'd like to say again, thank you to all our speakers and goodbye to all of you. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.